A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for being a part of another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is good to be behind the microphone once again after a great weekend in Colorado, where the Independence Institute was hosting their annual ATF party, their alcohol, tobacco, and firearms party, a celebration of all of the great things that you get to enjoy as an adult. There were sporting clays in the morning, and then cigars and some libations in the afternoon at the beautiful Kiowa Creek Sporting Club. Tell you what, if I lived in Colorado, man, I'd be spending my weekends out there at Kiowa Creek. That place is amazing. So I was lucky enough to be invited to be the keynote speaker, and it was a great event. So I got to thank all of the folks at the Independence Institute, John Caldera, all the way on down, Dave Copel, research director over there at the Independence Institute. It was just it's a fantastic event. It was great to see so many Second Amendment supporters. Colorado is a Second Amendment battleground state. Has been for quite some time. John Hickenlooper, former governor who signed gun control bills into law back in 2013. He is now running for the U.S. Senate after a brief foray into trying to run for president. That didn't really take off. Honestly, I don't know how well his campaign is going to go there for U.S. Senate in Colorado. We'll talk about that in just a minute with our friend Jim Garrity from National Review, who's going to join us talking about all kinds of the latest political news, because we're just a couple of weeks away from the Senate returning from their August recess and taking up gun control measures. One of the things that they'll be talking quite a bit about, we don't know all of the particulars about what this bill is specifically going to look like, but we do know that they'll be talking about some sort of red flag legislation. And over the weekend, we saw another state red flag law go into effect. This one, New York State. And you see there, WAGC says that the, quote, red flag law is drawing mixed reviews. Well, yeah, and they're right. I mean, basically, gun control advocates are happy that this law is on the books, and a lot of gun owners are not. Jacob Sullum with Reason Magazine noted some of the issues with New York's red flag law, going and starting with who can actually request one of these restraining orders here. As Sullum notes, the extreme risk protection order can be asked or requested by police officers. Okay, I don't think anybody has a problem there. Prosecutors. Okay. Blood relatives, in-laws, current and former spouses, current and former housemates, current and former girlfriends or boyfriends, people who have produced a child with the respondent, even if there was apparently no relationship. That's kind of weird. School administrators or their designees, teachers, coaches, guidance counselors. As Jacob says, the school personnel covered under the law can even report if a former student, or they can report a former student as long as it's been less than 6 months since they graduated. So this is, again, a very broad base of who can petition the court and say, listen, we think these folks are a danger to themselves or others. They need to have their firearms taken away. Ex parte orders, in other words, orders or hearings where you're not present. You are the subject of this request, but you are not present. Yup. New York State has those ex parte orders lasting up to 6 business days. They can be based on, quote, probable cause to believe that the respondent is likely to engage in conduct that would result in serious harm to himself, herself, or others. As Sullum notes, the purported threat need not be, quote, extreme or imminent. Just again, that there's a probable cause that we think this person is doing something that could pose a threat of serious harm to himself, herself, or others. As Sullum notes, the evidence from other states suggests that judges are going to basically rubber stamp these orders based on the ex parte hearings, because from the judge's perspective, better safe than sorry, right? There are some states, I think the lowest state that I've seen in terms of the approval rates is Maryland, and that was like 67%. A lot of other states, it's 90, 95% approval for these things. And again, you're not there to present your side of the story. After that ex parte order has been granted and you've got that emergency hearing where you're not a part of it, a final hearing can take place that you will be a part of. Sullum notes that the New York standard of evidence is a clear and convincing evidentiary standard that the respondent is likely to engage in conduct that would result in serious harm to himself, herself, or others. The prohibition on gun ownership would last for a year. It could be renewed by the state. As Sullum notes, again, there's no requirement that the threat be imminent. And he says that clear and convincing evidence is a more demanding standard of review than we've seen in a lot of other states. He said likely is a slippery concept in this context. Indeed. And again, one of the issues here is, so let's say the court says, all right, we think that, Cam here is likely to be engaging in conduct that would, lead to harm to himself or others. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to take any of Cam's legally owned firearms, and then we're going to leave Cam alone after that because we think that our job is done. See, again, that's where I have real issues with these laws because they don't address the individual that has been deemed to be a danger to themselves or others. They address one thing that individual may own, right? Well, again, we're going to get a lot more talk about red flag legislation here in a couple of weeks. Jim Garrity from National Review joined me just a short time ago to kind of break down what we might expect to see from the Senate, from the House side as well, and even some developments at the state level. Take a look and a listen. Mr. Garrity, sir, it is good seeing you again.
Cam, always good to be with you.
2 weeks from today, the Senate is set to resume session. Mitch McConnell says that gun control will be front and center, although we've heard a number of Republicans in the Senate say they don't believe that there's anything that they believe has the 60 votes necessary to pass, and that would include things that the president has talked about, including red flag laws, something to do with background checks. And at the same time, we've seen Democratic candidates move far beyond what the president is asking for, right? They're calling for gun licensing, banning the most commonly sold rifles in America. People who already own them, you got to turn them in. We'll give you some money. If you don't, then you become a felon. Where do you think we are right now in the gun control debate?
Yeah. One of the rare areas in which you saw a little bit of bipartisan cooperation was the discussion about red flag laws. I think it's worth noting that in the abstract, everybody seems to like red flag laws. I think some gun owners of the National Rifle Association has said that they don't oppose them entirely. They basically support the concept of them, but nothing that has been passed so far in any of these states strikes them as striking the right balance between preserving Second Amendment rights and also, very importantly, preserving due process rights. And I think even the most passionate advocate for red flag laws, my colleague David French wrote a very influential piece on this about a year ago. There's potential for abuse in this. You don't want every Tom, Dick, and Harry who's got a gripe with their neighbor coming along and saying, I heard he said he was, going to kill somebody or something like that. You better take his guns away. So any set of rules has potential for abuse. And, if cops are going to be happy investigating all this, and if judges are going to be adjudicating these sorts of things, you don't want the system clogged with every little, petty dispute or something. Now, having said that, I think it was the San Jose Mercury News just did a review, and I'll probably be writing about this on National Review Online in the near future. They looked at about the mass shootings over the last 3 years, and they found about 2/3 of the cases there was something that the shooter had done, indicating either violent thoughts, violent impulses, a desire to commit a mass shooting, posting online. There was something that made people say, comments to others, friends, family, stuff like that, that indicated this person was a potential threat. So, if you could, if the red flag law worked in every one of those cases, then you could look, okay, maybe that's 2/3. I think we'd all love to see a scenario in which the number of mass shootings dropped that dramatically. They also, by the way, looked at the assault weapons ban, and they looked at the problems with background checks. And they found that in 1/3 of the cases, the mass shooter had something that qualified as an assault weapon under the California law. In none of the cases, though, was that the only weapon that the mass shooter had brought to their aspiring massacre. They usually had an assault weapon and some sort of firearm that did not qualify as an assault weapon under California law. So theoretically, if you could presto changeo, wave a magic wand and take away all the assault weapons, the people who wanted to do mass shootings in the past 3 years would still have a gun and still be able to do some harm to others. And then the third one was background checks. They didn't find a lot of examples in which a background check problem had been an issue. They did mention Sutherland Springs in Texas. Interestingly, I think they didn't mention the Charleston church shooter a couple of years ago. Paperwork snafu, circumstance in which he had an arrest for drug possession that should have barred him from purchasing a firearm. Didn't contact the right law enforcement agency, and as a result, it didn't go into the system, and he was allowed to buy his gun. So, look, if you're me, that shows you where you should focus on, and also it seems like there's something of a bipartisan, appetite for this. However, it looks like the last time this was up there, remember Toomey Mansion and all these other proposals that were floating around out there. Democrats didn't want just the part that was bipartisan. They didn't think that went far enough, that it wasn't extensive enough for them. They weren't willing to accept half a loaf. Well, when you take that possession, you get no loaf. And my suspicion is that since I don't think the dynamics of this issue have changed a great deal, I would be very surprised. Now, maybe you see enough pressure on Democratic senators to say, look, we've got Republicans going along with one idea that we like. Let's get that done. I suppose, again, if they decide to say, we've got to end the gun show loophole, even though none of these mass shooters purchase their guns at gun shows, my suspicion is we'll all go back to it. And it's entirely possible that both the president, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, the Democratic presidential contenders, maybe sadly enough that everybody's just happy to run on this issue into 2020.
That may very well be the case. And it's interesting because you talk about the red flag laws, and we just had New York's red flag law go into effect over the weekend. I was talking about this at the beginning of the show. And, it's interesting. I read that Mercury news story, and one of the things that they cited, one of the examples that they cited was an individual in California who was just arrested. Apparently had been planning to murder his coworkers and perhaps guests at a hotel where he worked. And they brought this up in conjunction with the red flag laws, even though California's red flag law wasn't used in that case. An arrest was actually made, right? He's going through the criminal justice system now. And this is something that really does concern me when it comes to red flag laws. And the Mercury News doesn't really get into this. But I want to hear, I'm kind of like you, Jim, theoretically, okay, I see the need. Or not, I wouldn't say I see the need. Theoretically, I understand where the desire for a red flag law is coming from. And theoretically, if, again, you could write one that was full of due process protections that actually focused on the individual who is deemed to be a danger to themselves or others rather than any firearms they might own, that's something that I might be able to get behind. But I'm having a really hard time figuring out, okay, where's the scenario where the red flag law is the most appropriate tool to use as opposed to the existing criminal justice system or the existing civil commitment laws, which are already on the books in all 50 states around the union. And even reading that Mercury news story, I wasn't presented with any sort of scenario where it's like, okay, look, this is where this would be the most appropriate tool to be used. This is something that I think the supporters of these red flag laws, they really don't seem to want to talk much about that. It's just, well, we got to have this. And if we have it, then it'll be a valuable tool. I'm not convinced, honestly.
Yeah. Oftentimes, in fact, just recently, I was having this discussion with some folks who are near and dear to me. And the infamous phrase, Jim, we have to do something, came up. And that's, one of my least favorite phrases because you can do something, but doing something is not a synonym for a solution. And so as you're observing these other tools that are on the books, the other thing, I think one of the other objections that the NRA had made and other folks point out is that, so most of these laws say if someone is a threat, someone's a danger to others, a threat to themselves, all that kind of stuff, well, then the government steps in, the police step in, the judge adjudicates, and they take away the firearms. And then everybody goes home. Right. There's nothing further about the fact that you've got somebody who presumably has said, I'm going to kill people, or alternately, they're going to harm themselves. And most of us would look at that and say, okay, that's a step. That's really not doing anything about the real problem here, which is that this person has either homicidal thoughts or suicidal thoughts, or clearly needs more than merely taking their firearms away. And it's kind of striking how much we're not seeing that part of the equation. Now, my suspicion is this gets into circumstances of involuntarily putting someone into a mental institution. And that is a very painful, frustrating, and stressful and emotionally draining circumstance. And it's understandable, people have the very best of intentions when they opened up the institutions a generation ago and said, no, we're going to go out and let these people live their lives. They're no harm to anyone. Let them be free. And we've seen the consequences of that. It has had deadly consequences for a great number of people. This is not to say everyone who's suffering from mental illness is a threat to others. You know, there are some of the most wonderful people in the world, you know, are technically diagnosed with mental illness. And let's face it, Cam, there are so many people who are not diagnosed, but who seem cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. To begin with, it's kind of hard to determine in our society who really, you know, who are the crazy ones. That having been said, if you are, you know, thinking about harming yourself, thinking about harming others, then other people do, I think, have an obligation and duty to step in. And when each one of these cases, when they point to these 75, or these 2/3 of the cases studied by the Mercury News, there was no law preventing, there's no law preventing any of these people from doing so and saying, you know, my brother thinks he's going to hurt someone. My son thinks he's going to hurt someone. We heard about the case of the shooter down in Texas, where the mother did call the police, but didn't give her name, didn't give her son's name. What is law enforcement supposed to do in a circumstance like that? You know, I think, you know, it was as much as it might, you know, people might say, well, we got to pass another law. If you really wanted this to stop, you'd probably have to say, you know, we have to be more comfortable with not merely taking away the firearms from people who are threatening people. Because, like, again, if someone's feeling suicidal, they still have other ways to kill themselves. If someone wants to harm others, there are still other tools to harm themselves.
Absolutely. You know, Connecticut's Red Flag, I was talking with a forensic psychiatrist about this last week named Dr. Dennis Petrocelli, and he noted that, you know, people who are advocates for these red flag laws will bring up Connecticut's and they'll say, look, you know, this apparently for every 20 red flag laws that were or you know, emergency violence protective orders that were issued, one suicide was prevented. So look, this is saving lives. But what Dr. Petrocelli noted is that, unfortunately, of the 19 others that were issued, some of those individuals went on to commit suicide, right? There have been at least 20 suicides involving individuals who were the subjects of red flag laws in Connecticut. And then, you know, you have to wonder, okay, well, if somebody had their guns taken away and they didn't commit suicide, were they really a threat to themselves or others? Or was this just, yeah, better safe than sorry, better take the guns away? You know, this is not, as you say, this is not a perfect solution. This is, I think, a way for a lot of politicians to say, okay, look, we did something and it's narrowly tailored and it's not a lifetime prohibition. You know, it almost seems to be the argument that I'm hearing is, listen, it's not that bad and we need to do something. So can't we just do this?
Something. Yeah, yes, that, you know, that slogan, you asked us to do something, we did something. It didn't really solve the problem, and now maybe we have more people stabbing themselves or hanging themselves or stabbing other people. But we got rid of the firearms, and aren't you proud of us for doing that?
Right.
Those who've seen these tragedies in our lives would say, "Nah, you've done half the job, guys. That you know, don't pat yourselves, don't sprain yourself patting yourselves on the back too hard."
So let me ask you about this, because I said 2 weeks from now, Senate's coming back in session. Next week, the House Judiciary Committee is going to be holding votes on 3 more gun control bills. End of September, they've got another hearing on a quote-unquote assault weapons ban that they want to send over to the Senate side. I don't think really any of these bills that the House is now looking at have a chance in the Senate, but I do think that these positions, banning the most commonly sold rifle in America today and telling people who already own them, you got to turn them in, banning magazines over 10 rounds, I think that these are becoming sort of the boilerplate positions now that you have to take if you are a Democrat running for president.
Yeah, and as much as we could say, look, none of this stuff is getting done before, nothing that gun owners would really strongly object to is going to get done before January 2021. You know, the president's not likely to sign it into law, even though he sometimes makes contradictory comments. Mitch McConnell's pretty clear. The Republican majority is not eager to sign gun control laws, other than maybe the red flag ones, right? So, but the problem is that, look, we don't know who's going to win the presidency in 2020. And we, you know, the majority of the Senate's Republicans is pretty small. What's his name? John Hickenlooper, who signed gun control into legislation into law when he was governor of Colorado, is now in the Senate race running against Cory Gardner. I think that race is probably in the neighborhood of 50-50. Colorado is kind of a blue turning state. You know, a Democratic Senate majority is not impossible. In fact, I think it's, you know, a pretty decent shot, maybe a 1 in 3 shot, maybe even more than that. If you get a Democratic majority, on paper, they could just get rid of the filibuster. I don't know if they actually will. But they could also try to attach gun control legislation to reconciliation bills or something like that. You might not need 60 votes to get some of these ideas through. Attach it to a budget bill or something like that. So, I mean, my suspicion is that as much as, gun owners might say, this probably isn't going to happen, and this is never going to have the votes of the Senate or something like that. Well, no, but if, Democrats have a good year in 2020 or pro-gun control Republicans somehow end up winning some of these races, then yeah, I think some of these legislation that, the things that are being talked about now could very easily become reality sometime in 2021 or 2022.
We'll get a preview of this here in a few months, by the way, because we've got the Virginia elections. Michael Bloomberg has committed to spending $2.5 million promoting pro-gun control candidates. Giffords is getting in the game. I think Tom Steyer might be spending some money as well. And yeah, again, you talk about slim majorities. We've got on paper right now, it's a 1-vote pro-gun majority in the state Senate, a 3-vote pro-gun majority in the Assembly. And Bloomberg is targeting about 13 Republicans who are currently in office right now. So, gun owners around the country, if they want to know what might be coming, just take a look at what's going on in Virginia right now. The gun control bills, the Governor Ralph Northam has promoted, and, knock on wood, and get out there and volunteer. But, hopefully we don't see gun control advocates win in November, because then, look, by the time, January 1st, 2021 rolls around, Democrats in Virginia could make this state look a heck of a lot more like California's gun laws instead.
Yep. And by the way, you mentioned our illustrious governor there, Cam. We're all red-faced about him because of other faces he's had. But as remember a couple months ago when that scandal broke, there was this attitude amongst Virginia Republicans of, look, as embarrassing as it was for the state and as bad as it was, there was kind of the sense of, we're just gonna do great in these state legislative elections. November can't get here soon enough. Look, Governor Northam is tweeting about race relations and the legacy of slavery, and that scandal, which was dominating the headlines coast to coast and was seen as probably the sort of thing that normally just blew up a career and forced a resignation immediately. It's kind of faded into the ether. Obviously, there's some people, I'm sure there are Republicans who are fired up about it, but by and large, I don't see that being a lingering issue in the state legislative elections. So the Republicans cannot count on, Northam's unpopular. Totally doesn't even indicate Northam's all that unpopular. A lot of Virginia Democrats are like, okay, maybe he wore a Klan hood, maybe he wore blackface. He tried to moonwalk in the press. He's a Democratic governor. We're cool. Look, we can't have the lieutenant governor step in, and we can't have the attorney general step in for either one of those guys. So we're fine. So look, the stakes are high in November, and that issue that everybody thought was going to drive Republicans to a really terrific year does not feel like it's going to be a major fact. Now, look, stranger things have happened. Maybe I'm sure Republicans may be bringing this up between now and November, but if you're counting on that, offsetting any push by Bloomberg and Steyer and the rest like that, I would not count on that. I think there's a real fight coming up in November in Virginia.
No, there absolutely is. Jim Garrity from National Review, as always, sir, it is great talking to you. Appreciate you joining us on the program today.
Cam, I always enjoy it. Hope all's well with you.
It is. We will talk again very soon. Jim Garrity joined us here on Bear Arms, Cam and Company. All right, let's get to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, and of course, our failures of the criminal justice system. In fact, let's start there. Springfield, Missouri, the Springfield News Leader notes that a Springfield man has been charged with first-degree assault in a shooting, even though they say he was not the one that pulled the trigger. Earlier this month, Springfield police responded to a call that a man had been shot in the leg. When officers got to this apartment, they found blood drops along the sidewalk, which led to an apartment. They found the victim inside. Victim told police that he'd been shot in the right leg and was, quote, bleeding a lot. I think the police were able to figure that out, by the way. They found out that he had been having problems with a man that he described as, referred to as K and Cadillac. Later identified as 44-year-old Lyle Siddell Williams. A victim said that he'd been having problems with Williams, that the man allegedly came to the victim's apartment around 3 o'clock that morning, began knocking on the door. Victim told Williams to go away, and he did, but he allegedly returned to the victim's apartment a few minutes before the shooting happened, asking to talk to the victim outside. Victim told police he put on his shoes. He walked outside towards an alley west of the building. Once he got to that alley, he said he saw Williams and two individuals that he did not recognize And then, well, you can guess what happened after that. The victim said that none of the subjects spoke to him. The one man brandished a handgun, pointed at him, then shot him 4 times. Changed his story a little bit when he was interviewed by police a couple days later. He said that Williams had handed a handgun to one of the other men and then shouted at the man to shoot the victim. Victim said that the unidentified man then pointed the handgun and fired 2 shots towards his chest. After the victim was shot, he ran back towards his apartment. Williams and the other men got into a vehicle and then fled the scene. Court documents right now don't identify the actual shooter in this case. Don't know if they actually know who that individual is. Now, according to the Springfield News Leader, Mr. Williams has a lengthy criminal history with 13 prior felony convictions. Not 13 arrests, not 13 charges, 13 prior felony convictions, as well as a conviction for second-degree assault. Right now, he's been charged with first-degree assault, which is a Class B felony. He's being held on $25,000 bond in the Greene County Jail, which I have to say seems kind of low to me, but okay. And there you go, Cadillac Williams there in Springfield, Missouri. Today's example of some plea deals gone wrong. Now, our armed citizen story for you from Baltimore, Maryland, where an off-duty Baltimore police officer and a retired Baltimore police officer ended up shooting a armed robbery suspect. Suspect in critical condition after being shot. He was later pronounced dead. The 2 victims in this case were standing on the street corners about 11:15 when they were at night, when they were approached by an armed man who was trying to rob them. As WJLA in Washington, D.C. Points out, the retired Department of Corrections officer and the school police officer who was off duty both took out their concealed guns and shot at the suspect, striking him multiple times. The suspect then collapsed. He was taken to a local hospital, where again he was pronounced dead on arrival. So, Baltimore, Maryland, you can't really get a concealed carry license. The only people who are legally carrying firearms in Baltimore are gentlemen like these 2 guys. Off-duty police officer, retired police officer. The average resident in Baltimore, Maryland is not going to be able to obtain a concealed carry license because you can live in the worst neighborhood in Baltimore. And you can be the finest, most upstanding citizen in that bad neighborhood. And you can say, listen, crime is awful. I want to be able to protect myself and my family. Maybe I want to walk my kids to and from the bus stop. And they're going to say, well, why do you need a gun? You're going to say, did you not hear me? I live in a really awful neighborhood and I want to be able to protect myself. And they're going to say, well, that's not a good enough reason. Just you wanting to be able to protect yourself is not a justifiable need. That's not a good enough cause for us to consider giving you a permit and a permission slip for you to carry a firearm. Maryland is a may-issue state, and it doesn't matter if the issuing authority, Maryland State Police, don't believe that you have a good enough reason. I work in a job where I'm required to carry on a lot of cash or jewels. Maybe that'll get you. I've got somebody who's actively stalking me. I can show evidence of threats right now. Look, this is where the person says they're going to try to kill me. Then you might be able to get a concealed carry license. But your right to bear arms is basically non-existent in the state of Maryland. And, there are a lot more Baltimore residents who are not off-duty police officers, who are not retired police officers, who are the victims of armed robberies, than there are law enforcement who are the victims of armed robberies. Clearly, it is possible, as we just saw, for individuals to defend themselves against armed robbers in Baltimore if they have a firearm of their own. You shouldn't have to be a police officer, off-duty or retired, in order to do so. And if Maryland was a shall-issue state, where you met the statutory requirements to get a concealed carry license, you got your concealed carry license, I'm guessing that you would have thousands of Baltimore residents who would choose in very short order to get that concealed carry license to protect themselves and others. It's just not a possibility, unfortunately, right now. All right, let's get to our good deed of the day. From Michigan, Westland, Michigan, you're looking at a couple of police officers who really did go above and beyond the call of duty to help out a veteran, Chaim Kozak and Rodney Donald. And that is a shadow box with medals belonging to a gentleman named Vince Berna. Vince founded a group called Veterans Haven in Wayne, Michigan, and his medals were actually taken from him, stolen from that organization that he founded. And, once these things disappear, it's really, really hard to get them back. Judy Berna said that her husband was really upset when these medals disappeared. They called the police and asked to see if they could do something. They didn't recover the medals, but Officer Kozak, who is a Purple Heart recipient himself, and his fellow officer Rodney Donald, when they learned that Mr. Berna's medals had been stolen, they worked on their own time and on their own dime to research, to find, and to order replacement medals for Mr. Berna. And Chaim Kozak said to see her expression and to see how much it meant to her and knowing how much it was going to mean to him, he said it meant the world to me. He said, because those medals, there's no money value to them. He said, but the sentimental value is priceless. Officer Kozak and Officer Donald asked their commanders if they could commit to replacing the medals for Mr. Berna and his family. And Officer Kozak said there was no hesitation. They said, do what you have to do to get these medals replaced. They were 100% supportive. He said they were all for it. And from that point on, the journey began. So they looked through old pictures. They looked through military documents. They talked with Vince Berna's family. They talked to the local VFW post to confirm the medals that Vince Berna had received: the Army Commendation Medal, Vietnam Service Medal, National Defense Service Medal. Officer Kozak says this was really kind of personal for him. He said he thought about his own life growing up in Westland, Michigan, serving in Afghanistan and Iraq as a Marine Corps infantryman, living with these scars and other reminders, Hometown Life says, of a detonated roadside bomb. And he said behind each medal, you have a story of what you had to go through with your fellow comrades. He says each medal that he earned, I knew how much it took. I understood it. If I ever had my medals stolen and had someone bring those back to me, he said it would mean so much. Vince Berna founded Veterans Haven out of his apartment in 1993. He is 70 years old, married to his high school sweetheart, Judy. He is now in an assisted living facility. Vince Berna is not in the best of health. Don't know how much longer he's going to be here. But those medals that were stolen from him, those replacements, are now hanging on a wall in his room where he can see them every day, thanks again to the efforts of these officers there in Westland, Michigan. We thank you for being in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing, and for your very, very good deed. So that is all the time that we've got for you on this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. I want to thank you again for being a part of the program. We'll be back tomorrow with the very latest Second Amendment news and information. If you like the show in podcast form, you can find it on iTunes, on Spotify, on Stitcher, and wherever your finest podcasts are available, including the townhall.com podcast page. If you like the video form, subscribe to Town Hall Media on YouTube, and you can get the show each and every day. Again, we're glad that you are part of the program. Thanks so much, and we'll see you here soon with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company.